Hello, my name is Jahan Marcu, and my presentation is entitled Vaping, Risks, and Product Safety. I am the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Endocannabinoid Medicine. For those of you who aren't familiar with my work, I've been studying cannabis and cannabinoids for about 15 years in academia, in the private sector, as well as working on regulations and standards for this industry. So today, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of an update about the vaping crisis and product safety around that and some of the things we've learned. And for those of you who may not remember this from last year, I'm going to share with you my test that I use to quickly catch up. And that's called the meme test. Is what are people saying out there? Memes are sort of the mirror for which we can see what's going on in society. And social media is actually a fair game for looking at health outcomes and public health risks. We'll talk about what are the risks and associations of different products in this space, the additive factors, overview of some of the stats from the last few months. And there's been a big update as the curve for the lung injuries associated with EVALI and vaping injuries have flattened. And part of the reason that is flattened is as of February, the CDC stopped tracking non-hospitalized visits. And we'll talk about how that has impacted the data a little bit. We'll end with talking about the anatomy of vape pens. What are they? How are vaporizers being used in clinical therapeutic studies and future directions? So if you look on social media, and start to peruse sort of the public perception of vaping and how people are handling it, it really kind of runs the gamut. There are people who are making a lot of home devices that sometimes defy common sense. When we think about people chronically consuming this, you may be thinking of a tiny little device, but one of the biggest issues that wasn't widely discussed in over the last year was the DIY crowd, is that there's a huge groups of people who like to make their own vapes. And that's one of the reasons a lot of vape apps are no longer in the Apple Store, is because a lot of them are used to help people build vapes safely and check resistance and voltage meters and things like that. But in addition to the DIYers, there's also people misusing these vapes, and you can find all sorts of videos of people inhaling them and sending the stream through their noses and ears and things like that these devices probably weren't doing. People's perception of this is like, yeah, who would have thought that inhaling chemicals into your lungs could be dangerous? But on the other side of that, people are saying, well, while the FDA and other agencies say they don't know these ingredients, many of the ingredients in these devices fall under the purview of the FDA. Some are even GRAS for oral consumption, not for inhalation. But we have this issue where we have people doing whatever they want, building their own devices, people using devices in the market in ways they weren't intended, and then confusion about what we know about what's in these ingredients. And on top of that, some people just see this as an evil thing. The reason it was called EVALI, this we'll get to, is not by chance. I'm pretty sure that was an intentional thing to kind of label this as an evil thing. But there's a lot of people who say that this is what they do instead of smoking cigarettes or smoking cannabis. When we talk about vaping, we're talking about both nicotine and cannabis products. And a lot of people, at least subjectively, anecdotally, say their lives are improved by not smoking cigarettes, instead using vaporizers. But not all vaporizers are created equal. And while these seem extreme, there's even ones that are even more extreme. My favorite that I found on Twitter is almost like a fake advertisement. Tired of non-toxic cannabis? Well, do we have the thing for you? Big mystery sticks, something patented that we can't tell you about with lots of chemicals. And you know what? They're not listed on the package sometimes. And that's true for products that aren't regulated. That is, products that aren't sold by licensed operators. So here's a brief history about electronic cigarettes, at least in the cannabis space. The first proto e-cigarettes were actually introduced in the early 90s and didn't really start to rise in popularity to the late 90s and 2000s, but they were really strongly introduced in about 2007 into the US cannabis market. And again, several cannabis-derived products that are on the market can be vaporized, and cannabis oil, hash oil extracts skyrocketed in popularity because there was now an efficient and discreet way to start to use these products that didn't involve, blow torches and setting things on fire to consume it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can find plenty of information about that on the net. Meanwhile, Colorado and Washington State see their sales skyrocketing of these devices. And up until this vape crisis, it's estimated that hundreds of millions of these devices, vape pens for cannabis, were sold. For about, some estimates say over 200 million before we started seeing issues with lung injuries. So this is a little timeline of the vape crisis starting in 2018. There were starting to be some documentations of hospitalizations from CBD vapes. People were, to be fair, it was not the CBD in these vapes. It was the synthetic drugs and other additives that were in them that were leading to these hospitalizations. However, there also started to be a buildup in 2018 up until August of cases of vaping-related illness, not just from THC products, but nicotine products. And in August 23rd, after a buildup over the summer, the first reported death in Illinois. And this followed a lot of reports about associations with THC-containing products. We'll talk a little bit about the former FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, wrote a Washington Post editorial, which he basically said some very interesting things, which caused some panic, both in the industry and public and in the media. And as we start to see more and more issues, it's the sixth death reported in September. By September, we're starting to see states ban all flavoring agents. The FDA is announcing criminal probes. We see a CBD supplier facing guilty charges to injuring people in Utah and Virginia with products that were contaminated. We see Massachusetts temporarily ban all products, and culminating basically in the FDA saying don't use THC vapes, even though it's really only products on the illicit market or products that weren't meeting safety standards. And the CDC then targeted vitamin E acetate as one of the main culprits, but it yet does not explain all the symptoms of the vaping issue with the lung illness. The part of what's difficult about EVALI is that it's not just from one thing. It really can be from anything that damages your lungs that leads to hospitalization associated with vaping. So the former commissioner of the FDA, who stopped being commissioner in April 2019, right when this crisis was starting to gain traction, said, bright lines must be drawn between less harmful ingredients and those that cause undue risk. That would arm regulators with information to crack down on illegal and dangerous vapes. And he also said it's time to end the political ambivalence that allows THC and CBD to evade oversight. And some of this stuff is a little tongue-in-cheek because there are a lot of regulations in states that regulate these products. And there seemed to be some confusion, even at the FDA, of where the issue was coming from. Again, it largely seemed to be with illicit manufacturers in gray areas, unlicensed manufacturing and distribution of these products. The acting FDA chief also said that, this is a top priority for the FDA. They're working tirelessly to gather information. And by the time we hit October, we started to see a lot of these cases decreasing and decreasing and decreasing. So where are we now? Well, currently the CDC is no longer reporting, is only reporting hospitalized cases associated with vaping injuries, the vaping product use associated lung injury. So what that means is that prior numbers were including all cases, and non-hospitalized cases have been removed from all previously reported data that the CDC had on the website. So while we thought that there were many thousands of life-threatening issues with these cases. There was about 2,800 as of this year. The most current website today is of February 18th, 2020. And there's been 68 confirmed deaths with the average age of about 49 or 50 years old. And as you can see from the little map, where you have the dark blue and dark green, we see the most cases. So Texas stands out, New York as well. So what is the risk here? So how can you protect yourself in this sort of confusing era? Well, it's the same as it's always been. You should avoid inhaling substances from inexpensive disposable type hardware. A lot of the sources of injury overwhelmingly include do-it-yourself manufacturing crowd, illicit, gray, and unregulated markets. Actual vaporizers, such as herbal vaporizers, are in no way associated with EVALE or lipoid pneumonia, which was one of the things associated with vitamin E acetate leading to the hospitalization. Exposure to really sort of any sort of aerosol can have significant risks, especially if it's heated. So a lot of times you see this coughs and shortness of breath associated with this. And again, the diagnosis of this ranges from any sort of kind of lung issue. You have eosinophilic pneumonia, lipoid pneumonia, organizing pneumonia, respiratory bronchitis, and these sorts of things. And sometimes mechanical ventilation is required as sort of a lung protective strategy. So I'm just going to talk about lipoid pneumonia a little bit, because this is actually something we understand a little bit about, and however, it does not explain all of the hospitalizations and all of the cases, but it was a focus of the FDA investigation. So this is basically inflammation due to foreign lipid-like material that the lungs can't effectively clear or break down. Leads to compromised air exchange. You know, your lungs have a very special tissue, and when you put layers of stuff down there, it affects not only the lungs' ability to expand and contract and move, but also the distance of which oxygen has to diffuse through. And if you put a layer there, it makes it very difficult. And this is also a difficult condition to diagnose. So when it comes to lipoid pneumonia, what's interesting is up until recently, there were only a few case reports associated with e-cigarettes over the last 10 years. Now, which is very surprising, because up until the vape crisis last year, there were hundreds of millions of vape products sold in the US alone. So there can be aspiration of other things that cause lipoid pneumonia. And this has been documented for mineral oil, paraffin, and even kerosene. Less commonly reported, but have been reported, lipoid pneumonia has come from accidentally inhaling milk, poppy seed oil, egg yolks, using spray paint, cleaning oil-containing vats, siphoning diesel fuel, long-term use of petroleum jelly, long-term use of WD-40, etc. And one of my favorite case reports is actually the excessive use of chapstick, lip balm, and lip gloss have been associated with developing lipoid pneumonia as well. So the purpose of this slide is just to let you know that vaping did not create a new illness. A lot of these lipoid pneumonia and other conditions have been around for a while. How long, you say? Great question. So I guess this is some of the audience participation is, when do you think the first case report of lipoid pneumonia was ever published? Was it 2019, 2018, in the 60s, 1930s, or 1890s even? Well, if you said A, you're wrong. If you said B, C, you're wrong. If you said D, you are correct. So everyone who got that wrong, I want to see you after this PowerPoint for a brief discussion about your progress. Just something one of my professors would say. And so here's the reference from the American Journal of Nursing on one of the the earliest case of lipoid pneumonia that I could find. So what are these products that people are using? They come in many shapes, sizes, and disguises, but essentially they consist of a battery, a heating element, and a chamber or reservoir for a liquid to go through. So the liquid sits in a reservoir, passes through a heating element atomizer that then comes out a mouthpiece. Fairly straightforward. Where it gets a little tricky is in the actual performance of these devices. Their performance is all over the place, and the less expensive they are, the less reliable they are. You may be surprised that in less expensive devices, you might put down a button and it might be one temperature one time and then 100 degrees hotter the next. You really have no idea about the thermoregulation of some of these devices, which can lead to unpredictable outcomes. And then another issue here is that it's also very difficult to dilute cannabinoids safely. If you want, cannabis oil is very sticky. It's not made to flow through nicotine delivery devices, and so it has to be diluted. But if you dilute it too much, you then have to add things to make it thicker so that it doesn't leak. And it's in this we see really dilute products that are mostly excipients and that will lead to issues down the line potentially if they're overheated. So how can you tell if you have a true vaporizer or not? There's a simple one, and this is from my colleague Dr. Russo's 2016 article. Everybody loves advice that rhymes, so if it's red hot, then vaping, it's not. And so this is not a vaping device. That red hot coal is burning the material. I spoke to a combustion chemist that worked at R.J. Reynolds, and the most technical term for this is smoldering, where you take something and you basically put it against a red hot coal that sets it on fire. You do get some micro vaporization, but overwhelmingly things are getting burned by this device. There are true vaporizers that have been approved and used in clinical studies. Among them, the Volcano has been used in a clinical study, notably by Dr. Donald Abrams in HIV/AIDS patients. PAX, it's just a disclaimer, I'm on their health advisory board. They also have devices in a clinical trial, for example, at UCSF, looking at different ratios of cannabinoids. So there are safe devices out there that go through incredible pains to make their devices safe, efficient, reliable, and even use them in clinical studies. So this tocopherol vitamin E that's found in vape devices, it's not found in cannabis, but it's found in high levels in many products associated with hospitalization. It's an oily substance that's very common in foods and skincare products. It's actually generally regarded as safe by the FDA for oral consumption. And what's weird is that actually some studies have looked at the benefits of vitamin E inhalation for various conditions. But there are no guideline compliant studies or clinical trials to demonstrate the safety of vitamin E to a significant degree. And what makes it an issue, and we'll talk about towards the end of this presentation, is that there are different forms of tocopherol, different versions, different isomers, and they have different effects on inflammation. So if you're using a very inexpensive, not for human consumption, tocopherol, vitamin E preparation in your devices, you're probably going to have a lot of compounds in there that are going to complicate the toxicology risk assessment. So again, while tocopherol acetate is likely to have similar systemic effects to vitamin E, there might be some curveballs there. So once it gets in your lungs, if it got in your lungs and it stayed there and everyone was the same, we'd see a lot more cases of hospitalization. But our lungs express proteins, which help to break down things that get in there, notably the CYPs, right? They're there. Our liver also has these for breaking down drugs and other substances, but these are in our lungs as well. And One of the best hypotheses I've heard is actually an old one, which said that, if people have different versions of these enzymes, which affect their sensitivities to drugs, if they also have those in the lung, it might mean that individuals metabolize tocopherol differently in their lungs. Some people can clear it out right away. Some people can't, and this is a genetic factor, which basically means you either get a really good copy of the protein that's really great at chewing up vitamin E, or you got a slower copy that's not so great at doing it. But it's believed that vitamin acetate can cause lipoid pneumonia in some individuals if their metabolic capability is not sufficient in the lungs. And the last thing about vitamin E is that, up until, since about 1971, until this, issue started, there are really only 2 cases of lipoid pneumonia associated with vitamin E, which is very surprising, given how widespread it is. People cook with it, right? But again, there's not, despite people cooking with a lot of vitamin E and being exposed to it several hours a day, you'd think of a sous chef or someone who's frying foods all day, they're getting exposed to that stuff. But there really is no publicly available data regarding the heat degradation of these products. But it's unlikely that, acutely or systemically toxic at low doses. So, it's probably a good sign that chefs aren't getting lipoid pneumonia from cooking with tocopherols. And again, one of the biggest issues could be that, at a certain temperature, maybe these, vitamin E isn't as dangerous, isn't as risky than when it's at an exceedingly high temperature in a poorly controlled devices that leads to producing all these other compounds. And those other compounds kind of bring us to our next section here. We're going to wrap up the vitamin E and talk about terpenes to finish this presentation. So again, tocopherol acetate will focus, does not explain the entire crisis. It was detected in almost all the fluid samples they tested in lungs, but not in all the products that cause the illness. Agencies have reiterated that this compound was not detected in all samples associated with EVOLI. Medium chain triglycerides seem to be one of the lower risk additives for these devices. Terpenes and other agents are significant factors. But again, I'd like to just stress that this vitamin E hypothesis does not explain many of the symptoms that people are explaining, given that we have controlled studies looking at vitamin E inhalation from the 90s. And why do I say vitamin E doesn't really explain the whole vape crisis? Well, in order to get the gastrointestinal effects, for example, that is one of the main symptoms of EVOLI, you'd have to consume about 1,000, milligrams through vaping, through inhalation. And even a, cannabis aficionado, and this is not a challenge to anyone who uses cannabis, but, you couldn't expect someone to consume more than a couple hundred milligrams of oil per day in one of these devices. So this suggests that there are additives or other contaminants contributing. Maybe pesticides, heavy metals, flavorings, or issues, again, also associated with concentrated products. So this is a great slide courtesy of my colleague, Brad Douglas at the workshop. And why I like this slide is because it lists all these terpenes in cannabis, but also lists their chemical identifying number. And this is very important because not all crofelein is created equal. Not all limonene is created equal. You want to make sure you're getting the right compound at the right purity for the proper use, because you might be getting some of these compounds, alpha versus beta pine, they have isomers, they have different versions, they have different isomers, and this is a very important, I think, consideration when we think about purity and flavoring of compounds. There are problematic flavoring agents. These don't, as far as I know, naturally occur in cannabis, but they are used. Diacetyl. This one is a creamy flavoring agent that is associated with a lot of issues, and I would say should probably be avoided at all costs. Acetoaldehyde, as well is something that's commonly seen. But these, again, are some problematic. The ones highlighted in yellow are ones I suggest avoiding at all costs. So as you're going through this information and trying to be safe out there, I think it's important to distinguish between flower and concentrate vape devices. They do not pose the same risks, especially if you're using, let's call it, expensive vaporizers. And expensive flower vaporizers in 2 separate clinical studies have showed improved lung function in patients. And this might be because they stopped smoking and were using a vaporizer. Again, there's a clinical trial that I think is still recruiting right now at UCSF, looking at different ratios of THC and CBD in a flower vaping device. And again, when we talk about, high temperatures, propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, these decompose, generating potentially harmful compounds. It's thought that, smoking some of this stuff could represent about a smoking session, but it basically equates to about 1% of your daily exposure limit for things like aldehydes or formaldehyde from using a device, inexpensive device that's chock full of excipients and compounds like that. So there's a couple other things to keep in mind as you're navigating vapes. Again, important to distinguish between herbal vaporizers, high-end devices, and e-cigarette disposable type devices. Some are more reliable. Some are made with great pains to be compliant with regulations. Others are not. One interesting hypothesis I have is that the trade war may have exacerbated this situation. So about this time last year, there was a trade war going on with China, and it may have led to less reliable parts and pieces and devices where all of these vape products coming from as an indirect cost of that trade war. So there's less quality available. What would have been helpful was to have a robust response that analyzed products before and after the crisis. And we really have not seen this. Like, what changed in the supply that causes? Because again, hundreds of millions of these products were sold before there were any significant reports about these products. Again, remember that a lot of companies go through great pains to be compliant with health and safety regulations and product safety standards, and those are the ones who you should support. Gray market CBD vapes are a concern and show more, if not the same issues as THC vapes. And this has been since 2015. Actually, I'm not going to name names, but a CBD producer gave out CBD vape pens at a celebrity award show in Hollywood, and in everyone's gift bags. And those were full of not only some of the nasty things we mentioned earlier, but also synthetic drugs as well. And a few years later, that person who was in charge, whose products were sort of the poster child for the vape crisis, is looking at jail time. Always think about hardware issues, disposable versus cheap versus expensive. And again, perceptions of what the FDA says. When the FDA says something is safe, it's usually within narrow parameters. So just because the FDA says something is safe doesn't mean it's safe by any means necessary of consuming it. So a lot of things are approved orally, for oral consumption by the FDA. It doesn't mean that they're safe through every route. And always temper your understanding of the vape crisis by remembering that there's a huge unstudied population out there of do-it-yourself vape enthusiasts who are building their own devices. And these, there's reports of these exploding, of people getting hurt with these processes from not doing it correctly. And so to sum up everything, it seems that the vape crisis was largely an issue with unregulated markets and in the DIY vape enthusiast crowd. Health officials consider rampant hidden adulteration the greatest risk associated with vaping CBD products as opposed to consuming it in any other form. The industry needs to act, needs to have chemical inventories, lists of additives that are natural versus those that are not, provide resources to regulators, establish independent expert panels. It seemed like a lot of the industry just sort of stuck their head in the sand to wait for this to pass. This is an example of things that I think the cannabis industry will continue to face: safety of their products, backing up claims. And I think this is going to be really important as we move towards increasingly tighter and tighter regulations. So thank you all so much. I encourage you to check out the American Journal of Endocannabinoid Medicine. It's a free public access journal. And you can go to the website, ajendomed.com. Here are covers of our last 2 issues. I'm happy to answer any questions, and feel free to send me an email. Thank you.